In a world where truth is forgotten and curiosity fades, one voice dares to reignite the flame. Welcome to Vision Kindle, where the past speaks, the future unfolds, and knowledge becomes power. From ancient civilizations to cutting-edge science, every story here is a spark to question, to explore, to awaken. So open your mind, explore the unknown, and let your curiosity guide you. Because in this channel, we don't just talk about history. We ignite the fire of learning. We bring the past to life so that you can see it, feel it, and experience it. So if you're ready to embark on a journey through time, if you're ready to unlock the secrets of the past, then this is the channel for you. Subscribe now and join our growing family of curious minds. And together, let's explore the endless possibilities that await us. This is our channel, where the past meets the future, and every story is a spark waiting to ignite your curiosity. So open your mind and get ready to explore. What if the world you live in isn't as modern as you think? What if the echoes of plague and persecution and power still linger in your politics, your beliefs, your daily life? We call it the Dark Ages, a time of chaos, ignorance, and silence after the fall of Rome. But was it truly dark or just misunderstood? In this film, we uncover how the 1,000 years of medieval history shaped your world, from your legal system and religion to your fear of outsiders and resistance to change. You didn't escape the Dark Ages. You were born into them. Let's start with the law. You know, the rule of law, due process, innocent until proven guilty. These are cornerstones of modern society. So it must have been a shock when recently a country introduced the death penalty for insulting the president on social media. But medieval legal systems weren't so different. In fact, one of the most important documents in the history of human rights was written by a medieval king. Magna Carta, 1215. It established the principle that everyone is subject to the law, even the king. And yet, despite this progressive step, the medieval era was full of abuses of power and injustice. Take a look at these illustrations from a 15th century legal manuscript. They show people being tortured. Don't forget the Salem witch trials. Over 200 years later, European witch craze would inspire similar persecutions around the world, including the infamous trial of the sorcerer of New Haven, which ended with the execution of an innocent man. So if you think the pursuit of justice is a modern idea, think again. The concept of justice, like many things, can be traced back to ancient Greece. And in medieval Europe, there was a flourishing of legal thought. But the period's most enduring legacy is its emphasis on religious law. For better or worse, the medieval era saw the codification of canon law, the body of laws governing the Catholic Church. Canon law was based on natural law, the idea that right and wrong are universal and unchanging, that they come from God. This had a profound influence on the development of Western law. And today, canon law remains an important part of Catholic teaching. Canon law also played a key role in shaping medieval society. For example, the Church's ban on usury, practice of lending money at interest, helped to create a climate of mistrust between Christians and Jews. Medieval Christians believed that Jews were inherently greedy and that they used usury to exploit Christian borrowers. This stereotype would have a lasting impact on anti-Jewish violence in Europe. And what about those plagues, the Black Death, which killed millions of Europeans in the 14th century? Well, medieval attitudes towards disease were a mixture of fatalism and fear. Fatalism because they believed that disease was God's way of testing their faith. Fear because they did not understand the causes of disease, and they blamed everything from bad air to punishment from God. This fatalistic view of disease led to some bizarre remedies, such as the practice of bloodletting, which involved draining a patient's blood to balance their humors. But it also led to some positive developments, such as the establishment of the first hospitals and the creation of public health measures. But we should also talk about the Crusades, a series of religious wars sanctioned by the Latin Church in the medieval period. The First Crusade, which began in 1095, was called by Pope Urban II to recapture the Holy Land from Muslim control. The Crusaders seized Jerusalem in 1099 and established several states in the region. However, these states were constantly under threat from Muslim powers, and they were eventually all but destroyed by the mid-13th century. The Crusades had a profound impact on the relationship between Christianity and Islam, and they had a lasting effect on European culture. The Crusades have often been portrayed as a brutal and fanatical episode in history, but they were also a product of the medieval worldview. The medieval period was a time of great intellectual and cultural ferment. The rediscovery of classical texts led to a flowering of art, literature, and science. And the invention of the printing press made it possible to spread new ideas more easily than ever before. But this ferment wasn't universal. The medieval period was also a time of great poverty and ignorance. Most people couldn't read or write, and life was hard for everyone. But the greatest enemy of knowledge in the medieval period was the Catholic Church. For centuries, the Church had been the main repository of knowledge in Europe, but it actively suppressed any discoveries that threatened its authority. This attitude is perhaps best exemplified by the fate of Galileo Galilei, who was put on trial for his heliocentric theory, which placed the sun, rather than the earth, at the center of the universe. Galileo was forced to recant his views and spend the last 9 years of his life under house arrest. The medieval period was also a time of great upheaval: the Black Death, the 100 Years' War. The Reformation and the Renaissance all shook the foundations of medieval society. But these upheavals also led to major changes. For example, the Black Death led to a massive increase in wages and a decline in the power of the aristocracy. And the Reformation led to the emergence of new Protestant churches and a decline in the power of the Catholic Church. So the medieval period was a time of both progress and regression, of enlightenment and superstition, of great works of art and brutal acts of persecution. It was a time when the seeds of the modern world were sown, but also when the foundations of modern society were threatened. In many ways, the medieval period was a time of darkness. It was a time when ignorance and superstition held sway, and when the lives of ordinary people were brutal and short. But it was also a time when great works of art and literature were created, and when the foundations of modern society were laid. The medieval period is often characterized as a time of stagnation and decline, but this is a misleading and frankly very modern view. The medieval period was a time of great change and upheaval, and it was this dynamism that allowed the modern world to emerge. The medieval world was not a static or unchanging place. It was a world in motion, a world of constant flux and change. And it was this dynamism that allowed the modern world to emerge. The medieval world was not a monolithic or homogeneous entity. It was a world of many cultures and civilizations. And it was this diversity that allowed for the exchange of ideas and innovations that characterized the medieval period. The medieval world was not a simple or easy place to live. It was a world of great challenges and hardships. But it was also a world of great opportunities and achievements. And it was this resilience that allowed the medieval world to endure and ultimately to thrive. Many scholars now argue that the concept of the Dark Ages itself is outdated and misleading. Instead, they prefer to talk about the Middle Ages or the medieval period. This is because they believe that the term Dark Ages implies a simplistic and often inaccurate view of history. It suggests that there was a sharp break between the ancient world and the modern world, and that the medieval period was a time of intellectual and cultural stagnation. This is simply not true. As we have seen, the medieval period was a time of great intellectual and cultural achievement. It was also a time of great challenges and hardships. But it was these challenges and hardships that allowed the medieval world to be so resilient and ultimately to thrive. The Dark Ages. What were they? Well, if you're like me, you probably learned about them in school, those long centuries between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance. But if you've been paying attention, you might have noticed that your teacher was a little vague on the details. And that's because there really isn't much to say. You see, there wasn't much going on in the world during this time period. In fact, things were so bad that some historians have even called it the Stone Age of Europe. So why should you care? Well, you should care because I'm going to tell you all about it, starting with the big one, the myth of darkness. Nowadays, we think of those dark ages as a time of immense cultural progress, when great works of art and literature were being produced all across Europe. But that couldn't be further from the truth. If anything, it was a cultural desert. After the fall of Rome, Europe was plunged into total darkness. Trade routes collapsed, cities were abandoned, literacy rates plummeted, and the very concept of zero got lost to the West. And though some of that progress would eventually be recovered during the Renaissance, for the most part, Europe never reached the same heights again until the Industrial Revolution. But wait a second. If the Dark Ages were so dark, then why do we call them that? Well, because people back then thought they were living through another Dark Age, just like how we think of the Middle Ages as being in the Middle Age. See, they had their own name for the period between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance, the Latin Carolingian Age. But when the Renaissance rolled around, people started thinking of that old era as a dark one in comparison to their glorious age. It was kind of like calling the 19th century the dark times, if you will. And what better way to understand a dark time than by looking at its guardians? To put it simply, the guardians of memory are the people who made sure that knowledge survived the Dark Ages. And without them, we wouldn't know as much as we do today, you see. After the fall of Rome, Western Europe was in chaos. Invasions from the east and north left kingdoms in ruins, and no one was around to stop them. That is, until the Frankish king Clovis I united the tribes in northern Gaul and laid the foundation for modern France. His successors would go on to expand the Frankish kingdom into what historians dubbed the Carolingian Empire, and the empire's intellectual center was the court of its ruler, the king. There, under the direction of Alcuin of York, a team of copyists, artists and scholars painstakingly copied and illustrated manuscripts, thereby preserving ancient texts and making new ones. Without them, the Dark Ages could have been even darker. Which brings us to the structure of survival. When people think of the Dark Ages, they usually imagine peasants cowering in fear, while kings battle it out over scraps of land. But that wasn't the case at all. In fact, during the early Middle Ages, the king wasn't really in charge. That title belonged to the lord of the manor, the guy who owned the land where the peasants worked. See, after the fall of Rome, much of Europe was turned over to these local lords. They were responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining the peace, and most importantly, defending their people. In exchange, the peasants gave them a portion of their crops and did work around the manor in what was known as feudalism. It was a system designed to keep order in an otherwise chaotic world. Of course, that doesn't mean everyone was happy. Life on a medieval farm was hard, what with the long hours and high death rates. But that's not exactly news. What's more interesting is how life changed after the Black Death hit Europe in the 14th century. With a third of the population dead, peasants had more bargaining power than ever before. In fact, many manors dissolved as former peasants moved to the cities and became wage laborers. Now, this isn't exactly something to pop a bottle of mead over. After all, the plague had killed millions, and the shift to a capitalist system would eventually lead to horrible working conditions and widespread poverty. But compared to the rest of the Dark Ages, it was downright progressive. Which brings us to the big question. Why does any of this still matter? Well, because if you don't understand the foundations of your culture, then you're doomed to repeat them. Seriously, all of the problems we face today, from political polarization to economic inequality, have roots that stretch back to the Dark Ages. So if you want to understand the world you live in, you first have to understand the world that came before. What if you had the power to control the minds of men? With great power comes great responsibility. What would you do with that power if knowledge is truly power? Would you use it for good or evil? Or maybe you'd burn it, just burn it all. Throughout history, some people have sought to control the flow of information. When Knowledge Was Silenced is an original series that explores those times and the reverberations they had across the world. Join me as we examine how those who wield the power of silence often do so at great cost to themselves and others. Sometimes it takes a revolution to break the silence. Sometimes it takes one person. Ancient Greece was the cradle of democracy, philosophy, and history as we know it. Alexandria was its beating heart, home to the largest library in the ancient world. It was the place where knowledge from across the Mediterranean came to live, translate, and grow. But around 390 AD, the library began to fall into disrepair. Scholars fled the encroaching darkness of the Eastern Roman Empire, and the city was sacked multiple times over the next few centuries. By the year 400, most of the world's collected knowledge had been lost, sending the world into what some historians call the Dark Ages. We still don't know exactly how many books were lost, but we do know that there were about 400,000 scrolls, and another 90,000 clay tablets in the library when it was destroyed, and that was just in Alexandria. There were other libraries throughout the empire that also suffered. But the fall of these libraries wasn't just about the loss of books. It was also about the silencing of ideas. In Alexandria, scholars weren't just copying texts, they were engaging with them, debating their merits, and building new ideas on top of old ones. This exchange of ideas helped to shape the ancient world, and its destruction left a gaping hole in the pursuit of knowledge. So what caused the fall of these libraries? One reason was the increasing instability of the Roman Empire. As the empire grew weaker, it became more vulnerable to outside attacks, and as a result, cities like Alexandria were sacked multiple times over the course of a few centuries. Another reason was the rise of Christianity. Early Christians were often persecuted by the Roman authorities, and many of them sought refuge in the deserts of Egypt. Over time, this created a hostile environment for pagan scholars who eventually fled the city. Whatever the cause, the fall of these libraries marked a significant loss of human knowledge and understanding. It also signaled a growing trend towards silencing ideas that were deemed heretical or dangerous. Welcome to the next episode of When Knowledge Was Silenced. Throughout history, information has been used as a tool to control the masses. Governments and religious institutions have often sought to keep certain information out of the hands of their citizens in order to maintain power and control. But sometimes information is used as a weapon, as was the case during the Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition was a period of intense religious persecution that took place in Spain between the 15th and 17th centuries. During this time, the Catholic Church sought to purge Spain of heresy, and those who were accused of heresy were often tortured into confessing their sins. One of the most common methods of torture used during the Spanish Inquisition was the rack. The rack was a device that stretched and twisted the body, often resulting in broken bones and torn muscles. It's also not uncommon for those accused of heresy to be burned at the stake. The purpose of these punishments was to force people to confess to crimes they may or may not have committed. By inflicting physical pain and psychological torment, the inquisitors hoped to break down their victims and extract confessions of heresy. This information was then used to further the goals of the Spanish Inquisition and silence those who were seen as a threat to the Catholic Church. The Church has long been both a keeper and gatekeeper of knowledge. On the one hand, it has preserved and disseminated important texts and teachings. On the other hand, it has also suppressed heretical ideas and persecuted those who have challenged its authority. But why does the Church feel the need to silence dissent? And how has this affected the world? One reason for the Church's desire to silence dissent is that it helps to maintain order and stability within the institution. By suppressing heretical ideas and punishing those who promote them, the Church can avoid internal conflict and division. Additionally, the Church has historically had significant power and influence over the political and social order, and it has used this power to maintain control over those who challenge its authority. For example, during the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church played a major role in shaping European society and culture, and it used its power to suppress heretical ideas such as those of John Wycliffe and Jan Hus, whose teachings were seen as a threat to the authority of the Church. Overall, the Church's desire to silence dissent is rooted in its need to maintain power, control, and stability. While the Church has preserved and disseminated important knowledge, it has also silenced dissenting voices and ideas which have the potential to disrupt the status quo. Speaking out against the establishment can come at a great cost. Ask Marcus Garvey, an African-American journalist and activist who dared to criticize the government in the early 20th century. He paid the price with his life. Garvey was born in 1887 in Jamaica, and from an early age he was a vocal critic of racism and injustice. He went on to study law at Lincoln University in Missouri and eventually became a journalist, writing for newspapers across the country. But Garvey's outspoken nature soon got him into trouble. In 1917, he published an article in the Chicago Defender criticizing the draft, which required Black Americans to serve in World War I. The article was seen as a threat to national unity, and Garvey was arrested and sent to prison. After his release, he continued to speak out against the government, and in 1923 he was assassinated. To this day, no one has been held accountable for his murder. Garvey's story is a reminder that speaking out against the establishment can come at a great personal cost, but it's also a testament to the power of the free press and the importance of protecting civil liberties. Have you ever wondered how far medicine has come? About if it had been kept secret? From the days of Hippocrates to the Black Plague, the evolution of medicine has been a wild ride. and there were plenty of folks along the way who tried to keep certain treatments under wraps. Welcome to the next episode of When Knowledge Was Silenced. Medicine has been shrouded in mystery and secrecy throughout much of history. Those in power often try to keep medical knowledge to themselves for a variety of reasons. For example, during the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church had a strong influence over medical practice and teaching. The Church believed that the human body was corrupt and sinful, and that illness was a punishment from God. As a result, medical knowledge was often kept secret or suppressed, leading to a stagnation in the field. Another example is the case of lobotomy, a procedure that was used to treat mental illness by severing connections in the brain. Lobotomies were first performed in the early 20th century and were kept secret for fear of public backlash or professional repercussions. It wasn't until much later that the procedure became widely known and accepted. In more recent times, pharmaceutical companies have been accused of keeping the side effects of certain drugs secret in order to maximize profits. This has led to a loss of trust between patients and the medical community and highlights the importance of transparency in medical practice. Do you ever feel like you're living in the past? Well, maybe you are. The internet has opened up access to information like never before. But it seems like we re-headed back to the days of limited knowledge, with censorship and misinformation running rampant. Welcome to the next episode of When Knowledge Was Silenced. The internet has provided us with unprecedented access to information, but it's not without its challenges. We're currently experiencing a phenomenon that some are calling the digital dark ages. This is a time when the spread of misinformation and censorship is making it difficult for people to find accurate information on the internet. It's like we're living through a new dark ages, but this time it's not because of the destruction of physical books or the suppression of heretical ideas. It's because of the deliberate spread of fake news and the silencing of dissenting opinions. It's as if we've gone back in time to a period when knowledge was scarce, and those in power used that power to control the masses. But we can't let that happen. It's up to us to fight back against the spread of fake news and demand accountability from those who are trying to censor the internet. We have the power to bring back the light and make the internet a better place for everyone. Most people think of the Middle Ages as a time of widespread poverty and misery. But 90% of Europeans at the time were actually pretty well off by the standards of their age. So what's with the bad rap? Well, it helps to remember that medieval society was one of constant fear. And that fear was justified because life was dangerous. But also because the authorities wielded tremendous power over people's lives and often used it brutally. In fact, when we look around us today, we can see the lasting effects of this mindset. To understand why the Middle Ages were such a fearful time, let's break down this episode into 3 parts, using an analysis from historian Norman Cantor. First, we have to remember that for most of human history, the world was getting more hierarchical. Feudalism, manorialism, the growth of states and empires, all of this meant that there were more and more rules, regulations, taxes, and obligations placed upon people. So if you were alive during the Middle Ages and you didn't like your job, you couldn't just quit. In fact, you couldn't even change jobs, because you were typically born into one social class, and that was it. And not only were you stuck where you were, but you had obligations placed upon you simply by virtue of being a member of that class. For example, if you were a peasant, you would be required to work the land of your feudal lord. If you were a knight, you would be required to fight in his wars. And if you were a clergyman, you would be expected to pray for the souls of the living and the dead. So now let's introduce our second element, power. People who held more power than others justified their authority by claiming a divine right to rule. Kings were God's representatives on earth. They were obligated to maintain order and protect their subjects in exchange for their loyalty and obedience. In theory, this meant that if you did your part, you wouldn't get into too much trouble. But in practice, kings, queens, popes, and other authorities often abused their power because they believed that they were answerable only to God. Which brings us to the third element of medieval life, fear. You could be punished severely and suddenly for any number of things, such as committing a crime, falling ill, practicing the wrong type of magic, or even being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Imagine, for example, that you re a peasant living in medieval England, and you hear that King Henry VIII is on his way to your village. You know that you'll have to line the streets and cheer for him as he passes by. If you don't show your face, or worse, if you offend him in some way, your life will be forfeit. Or imagine that you re a heretic living in medieval France and you hear that Pope Innocent VIII has declared war on your sect. Now you live in constant fear of being denounced by your neighbor, arrested by church officials, and tortured until you confess your sins. Or maybe you're a peasant in medieval Germany, and you hear that the Black Death is on its way to your village. You know that nothing you can do will stop it, and when it arrives, it will sweep through your community, killing everyone it comes into contact with. All of these examples were common occurrences during the Middle Ages, and they were especially frightening because they were often random and inescapable. Medieval authorities understood the power of fear, and so they used it constantly to keep the populace under control. Kings commissioned the construction of giant stone castles to loom over their subjects. Popes built great cathedrals to remind Christians that God was always watching them. Judges and jailers made sure that criminals knew that they could always be taken back into custody. But how did this mindset affect life during the Middle Ages? It's impossible to say for sure, but historians believe that it had an enormous impact on people's behavior. If you wanted to be successful during the Middle Ages, it helped to be extremely cautious. After all, if you got on the wrong side of the king or the pope, you could be executed or have your property confiscated. As a result, medieval societies were generally very risk-averse, which in turn led to conservatism. People were afraid to question the status quo, because it might lead to chaos, and chaos meant that you could lose your head. This is part 2 of a series on medieval life. And while life during the Middle Ages was generally safe and prosperous, it was also filled with fear. We can see the legacy of this mindset today in our cultural obsession with hierarchy, power, and authority. But we can also see the flip side of this in our fear of those same things. After all, it was the fear of losing power that led to the abuses of authority that made the Middle Ages so terrible in the first place. Thousands of years ago, something remarkable happened. In a single stroke, they took an infinitely long river of moments and chopped it into discrete chunks, seconds, minutes, hours, days. And just like that, life was never the same. Suddenly there was more to do in less time. Humans began racing against the clock. They invented new tools and techniques to get more done faster. Entire civilizations rose and fell in just a blink of an eye. And as we stand here today, on the precipice of eternity, we are all terminally time-constrained. If you want to make the most of your life, then you have to start by understanding how someone else's life became so terribly short. Welcome to our channel. Join with us as we explore the forgotten history of institutions born in darkness. Let's begin with law. What would you say is the most important quality of a good legal system? Equality before the law, perhaps?
Us.
Or how about justice? Well, what if I told you that the first courts were neither equal nor just? They were divine. As in, they had a god sitting on the bench. Now, this may sound crazy, but it makes sense if you think about it. How could primitive humans decide who was right in a fight over land or livestock? How could they possibly know what constituted justice? They had no choice but to defer to the one they believed knew everything. God. Early religious texts are littered with stories of people bringing their grievances before the Lord. And as societies evolved, so did these systems. The Jewish Torah, for instance, established a court presided over by judges and scribes. But even as secular courts gradually replaced them, the idea that laws should reflect divine order endured. That's why even today, many of our legal systems are founded on concepts like natural law or divine command theory. We like to think that we're being rational, but often our ideas of right and wrong are actually coded into our DNA. Next, consider education. Kids are notoriously difficult to control, so naturally early schools were designed to be as much prisons as places of learning. That's why the first schools were attached to monasteries and run by priests. Only after the Protestant Reformation did they start catering to children of all denominations. Today, schools are mostly about teaching kids how to read, write, and do math. But did you know that at one point they were about teaching them obedience? Students were ranked based on their ability to follow rules and instructions. Those deemed incorrigible were often expelled. Interestingly, this system still exists, but now it's all online. Welcome to YouTube, where we rank videos based on how well they adhere to our notoriously draconian guidelines. It's no wonder you feel like you're back in school when you watch our videos. Moving on, let's talk marriage. Who do you think decides whether two people are allowed to get married? According to statistics, 94% of you thought Of course, the government. But that wasn't always the case. For most of human history, marriages were arranged by parents, priests, and yes, occasionally kings. Arranged marriages are still common in some countries, but thanks to colonialism, most of us are led to believe that only love conquers all. But that ideal only applies to heterosexual relationships. If you're gay and getting married, sorry, but you're still subject to the whims of family and tradition. So do we ain't to be surprised when your uncle shows up to your wedding carrying a priest in a straitjacket? Finally, let's discuss taxes. Every year, billions of people pay taxes without ever questioning where the money goes. But did you know that the concept of tax predates civilization itself? The first taxes were actually tithes paid to churches. And while the institution of tithing has largely fallen out of favor, the concept lives on through the practice of charitable giving. When you give money to a charity, you essentially paying a tax on your income with the expectation that it will go towards a greater good. But unlike taxes, charities aren't obligated to spend your money wisely or at all. Okay, so why does any of this still matter? Because despite the fact that humanity has come a long way since the days of caveman courts, the reality is that many of our modern institutions are still shaped by these dark practices. For example, the criminal justice system still relies on the idea of divine order, even though the vast majority of people it deals with aren't necessarily religious. As a result, many people view the law not as a set of rational guidelines, but as arbitrary edicts handed down by an uncaring elite. Likewise, schools, which were originally meant to be places of fun and exploration, have become rigid factories of obedience. And instead of fostering creativity, they've been reduced to teaching students how to take orders. The Renaissance wasn't a reboot. It was a revolt. In Florence in the 14th century, life was sweet if you were rich, powerful, and male. You could flaunt your wealth and power by commissioning art, building bigger churches, and generally being a patron of the arts. But if you weren't rich, powerful, and male, life was kind of terrible. Women servants, and get this, even children had no legal rights. And although humanism was starting to take root, that is the idea that humans are pretty great, life was still pretty bad for most people. That is until one group of rebels set out to change everything. Welcome to my channel. Today we're going to see how the Renaissance was not a rebirth of classical ideas, but a full-on revolt against the old order. For centuries, the dominant style in painting was Byzantine art, which is all those beautiful gold backgrounds with lots of bright colors and halos. It was also pretty unrealistic. Now, the wealthy elite liked this art because it reminded them of the divine right of kings and other conservative values, so they kept commissioning these paintings for their churches and their palaces. But there was a growing group of people who wanted something different, something that looked more realistic and less divine, right of kings. One day a wealthy merchant named Giovanni de' Medici decided he wanted a statue of the Roman god Mars. He turned to the most famous sculptor in town, a guy named Lorenzo Ghiberti, who had already made a name for himself making those awesome bronze doors for the baptistry of Florence Cathedral. But when Ghiberti presented his statue of Mars to the Medici, he was like, "Bro, that's kinda hot. Can you make me an Aphrodite too?" Ghiberti was like, "Ugh, fine," and sculpted Aphrodite. And then Medici was like, "Great job, bro. Now do, David." So Ghiberti put some fig leaves on David and called it a day. Now, this isn't really relevant to the video, but I just love the story of how Michelangelo stole David from the rich guy and gave it to the poor church. Anyway, sculpting David naked was a big deal. Not only was it more realistic than most Renaissance sculpture, but it was also a clear break from the more conservative Byzantine style. In fact, this statue of David is now one of the most famous sculptures in the world. But let's be real here. Small statue in a rich guy's palace isn't exactly revolutionary. What was revolutionary about the Renaissance was how ordinary people started questioning the status quo. I don't mean like the peasant class storming the castle. I mean a few intellectuals dared to question the role of the church in everyday life. Take Galileo Galilei, for example. He was an Italian astronomer who dared to look up at the stars and propose that the Earth wasn't actually the center of the universe. Here's the thing, though. Galileo didn't come up with heliocentrism. That idea had been around since ancient Greece. But he was the first person to use science to back up the idea that the Earth revolved around the sun, and that was a very big deal. But when he published his book, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, he got in a lot of trouble with the Catholic Church, which at the time was the biggest institution in Europe. They basically told him, hey dude, that book is totally wrong. Why don't you go back to dissecting frogs or whatever it is scientists do? And Galileo was like, nah, you guys are wrong. I saw it with my own 2 eyes. And the church was like, cool story, bro, but shut up and go back to dissecting frogs. Then they took his book out of print and put him under house arrest for the last 9 years of his life. Now that doesn't sound very scientific, but the biggest threat the Renaissance humanists posed was individualism. And by individualism, I don't mean I'm so unique individualism. I mean the idea that individuals can come up with new ideas and test them out in the world. For example, during the Middle Ages, everyone farmed the land according to the 3-field system, which is a method of farming where 1 field grows food, 1 field lays fallow, and 1 field grows fodder for livestock. But as the population grew, people started looking for ways to farm more efficiently. Enter a Dutch farmer named Jethro Tull, who invented the seed drill, a machine that would sow seeds more efficiently. Now, normally an idea like this wouldn't cause much of a stir. But keep in mind, this was the Middle Ages. Most people believed that everything had already been discovered, and there was no room for innovation. So when Tull came up with the seed drill, he was essentially going against everything the church had taught him. But he didn't care. He tested the seed drill and saw that it worked. And eventually the rest of Europe started adopting it too. And that's the story of how one man's individual innovation led to an agricultural revolution. So was the Renaissance really a rebirth of classical ideas? Well, yes, but that wasn't the main thing going on. The Renaissance was a period of huge intellectual and artistic innovation, but it was also a revolt against the old order. The Renaissance humanists weren't satisfied with the way things were, and they worked tirelessly to make the world a better place. And if that doesn't sound like a revolution, I don't know what does. The Renaissance wasn't a reboot, it was a revolt. You've just unlocked a glimpse into the unknown. But this is only the beginning. At Vision Kindle, every video is a piece of a greater puzzle. So if your mind is still burning with questions, don't stop here. Watch the next story, subscribe for more, and let your vision keep growing. Now, if you're still with us, then welcome to the family. We're so glad you're here. And if you're not already part of our community, then join us and be part of something special. We can't wait to share more with you. Until next time, stay curious. Stay kindled.